extremely organized about setting this up. So just to give you, my goal for this session is to give you a high-level overview of some of the tools and techniques in Agile, systems engineering, and Lean. So I'm going to try to go through a lot of material fairly quickly and hopefully leave time for questions at the end. I'm hoping to kind of strike a balance here because I know many of you listening may already be experienced practitioners of some of the tools and frameworks that I'll be talking about, but others might not be. So I'm not planning to get too detailed on any of the methodologies, but I'll provide some resources at the end and links if you're interested in learning more. I also know that ASQ Blue Ridge has offered and has upcoming webinars that will go into more depth about some of the things that I'll talk about, including A3 templates, and I think I saw there's a value stream mapping session in September. So I know even within the ASQ webinars, you'll have an opportunity to dig deeper into some of these topics. So a little bit about my perspective on things, and I know Norval's already shared with you my background. From my perspective, systems engineering, Lean, and Agile are toolkits for best practices, teamwork, continuous improvement. So while there's certain methodologies like Scrum that have some sort of recommended guidelines and ceremonies that should be adhered to, I always believe the application of these tools can be tailored to the type of work your organization does. So hopefully during the course of this webinar, I'll touch on some examples from teams that I've worked with from different organizations and how we've applied some of these concepts. You know, having worked at NRAO, NPR, where I was also the Quality Assurance Deputy Director, and Urban Institute, which is a research organization. There's sort of a wide variety of applications for these different techniques. So just to give you some background, the National Radio Astronomy Observatory designs, builds, and operates its own highly sensitive radio telescopes for use by scientists around the world. The main site for NRAO is the VLA, which is in Socorro, New Mexico, which if any of you saw the movie Contact, you would have seen it there. We're also involved in ALMA, which is the site in Chile. And until recently, we were involved in the Green Bank Observatory, which actually separated out at the end of the last fiscal year. So the Green Bank Telescope in West Virginia is operated now by the Green Bank Observatory. I know many of you are probably from the Shenandoah Blue Ridge area. We're only a couple hours away, so I'd encourage you to come see the site. It's worth seeing. It's the world's largest steerable radio telescope. There's a science center here, a lot of activities for families, so it's a neat place to come and see the telescope and some of the work that we do. So I think if I were going to summarize the goals for process and system improvements in the various organizations that I've worked with, a lot of it is around integrating business strategy with technical strategy and architecture to make sure that you're delivering value at the end of the day that's aligning business and technology. You know, the goal hopefully is to drive transformation and change, not just incremental improvements, really to simplify and integrate key processes and to really develop a multi-year vision for how you're going to maintain a competitive advantage going forward. So I think the goal of a lot of implementing some of these techniques and tools is to really make transformative change. Now, of course, there's always obstacles to change, and I've certainly run into these at several places. People and culture. I've had the luxury of working for a number of organizations that have long-term passionate employees, so they get used to doing things a certain way, so change can be challenging. Policies and procedures, I'm sure a number of you also deal with, you know, requirements, testing requirements, compliance requirements. So those kinds of things don't necessarily always lend themselves to being agile per se, but I believe that you can work in an agile mode even with those requirements placed on you. Processes within an organization can be complex and varied, and you know, the willingness of the organization to change and to make it a focus can vary as well. When I worked at NPR, the change was initiated by the team, so it was kind of a bottom-up approach to change. When I went to urban, it was a top-down mandate to look at being more agile and lean and more efficient. So I think in both of those situations, both of those extremes, change can happen and you can make it work. So what I'm going to hopefully cover in this session are some toolkits and ideas for getting started, selecting methods to fit the culture of your organization. I believe that lean and agile techniques can be combined. Like I said, it's a toolkit, so you can really sort of mix and match a lot of the tools. The nice thing about some of the agile methodologies is you can run time-boxed experiments, so you can try things and not necessarily have made an expensive or multi-year commitment to doing things. And a lot of these techniques are really built around the idea that you're going to continuously inspect and adapt what you're doing. So if something's not working, you don't necessarily have to throw the whole baby out with the bathwater, but you can tweak things and refine things and make them work for your organization or culture without having to just completely abandon what you started. So some of you may come from a traditional waterfall approach. Certainly, back in the day, most of the projects that I worked on were traditional, where you had a planning, design, build, test, deliver phase. And that's not uncommon even today. But some of those cycles can be, it's not uncommon in manufacturing for a new product to go through, say, a 14-year cycle. The system that Norval mentioned I worked on at NPR was a new satellite distribution system. So all told, that was probably over a 10-year project where, it got deployed at the end of all of these phases as sort of a big bang. But I think a lot of the new techniques that we're looking at are how can you do things in more incremental ways so that you get feedback, input, you can assess quality faster to know if you're heading in the right direction. So this is a software programming cartoon that I like to use. So to my earlier point about some of these things taking a long time, this graphic shows the various perspectives on a project. The first one is how the customer explained it, how the project lead understood it, how the analyst designed it, how the business consultant described it. Down at the bottom where there's nothing is the documentation, which is a problem that I know a lot of us have is, documentation seems to always get crowded out at the end. What operations installed, how the customer was billed, how it was supported, and then at the end you have the tire, which is what the customer actually wanted. So as you go through a project like this, and particularly if you're building something new or manufacturing something new, there's a lot of room for different interpretation. So I think what probably is kind of at the core of Agile is how do you deliver what the customer wants and know if you're on the right track sooner rather than later. And so the idea of this sort of iterative approach is that you can have checkpoints built into your processes so that you can determine earlier whether you're on track and you're delivering the right thing. But also I think part of what that also acknowledges is that a lot of projects spend a lot of time trying to build the last 20% of their requirements. And what you may find is that when you get to the end, you really didn't need that extra 20%, which in a lot of cases is what takes the most amount of time sort of getting to that finish line. So you can, if you're constantly prioritizing the activities and the tasks, doing the quality checkpoints, then you may find that you get to a point where you're 68% done with something and realize that it's actually good enough, or things have changed, technologies have changed, that there's a new priority. And so this iterative approaches kind of give you an opportunity to do checkpoints. So here's kind of a graphic that sort of depicts, the traditional waterfall going along, which could be, 1-year project, 14-year projects, whereas if you can find a way to sort of design, build, test in tighter cycles, you really get the ability to, number one, do quality checks, respect the fact that there are requirements changes that are going to come along, technology innovations, and build that into your cycles. So systems engineering, I don't know if you're familiar with INCOSE, which is the International Council on System Engineering. I'm a certified system engineering professional, so they have a whole framework around system lifecycle processes and activities. Most of it's based on sort of a systems development lifecycle that goes through a rigorous routine. Although, I think over time they have started to acknowledge agile and lean approaches within their methodology. And so they define agility as the capability existed by systems and processes that enables them to sustain effective operation under conditions of unpredictability, uncertainty, and change. So again, I'm going to think this is a sort of an acknowledgement that the world is moving so fast now that these approaches that enable change to be baked into the efforts and the projects and to deliver faster and to build quality checkpoints in earlier is kind of a necessary ingredient in today's world. Specifically on Scrum, it's an agile framework for addressing adaptive problems. So I'll talk a little bit about Scrum, but obviously I'll give you some links if there's more information that you're looking for on that. Generally speaking, Scrum is a pretty lightweight methodology. It's really easy to understand, but the last bullet point is important because it is difficult to master. Teams can generally get up and running pretty quickly, and then the continuous improvement enables them to become more efficient practitioners as they go along and to adapt sort of the rigors around Scrum to whatever the particular circumstances are. I've had experience working now with well over a dozen different Scrum teams and different types of applications. So there's always ways that in my experience, there's always ways to make it work regardless of what the circumstances are, and I'll talk more about that. So at its core, Scrum is a way of organizing work into cycles. So you would start with a product backlog, which is essentially your requirements, your tasks, the activities that need to be done. It could include defects, could include functional and non-functional items. And those get baked into what are called sprints, which could be anywhere from 7 to 30-day cycles where a team pulls out the most important things that they're going to work on into these sprints, which represent the commitment of the team for what they're going to do. And the idea of Scrum at the end is that you come out with potentially a releasable product or releasable code. I'll talk a little bit more about this because, frankly, none of the teams that I've worked with, with maybe a couple of exceptions, have really been delivered at the end of a 2-week sprint a releasable code, but it does happen. An NPR, for example, the Digital Media Group worked at a very fast pace doing web applications, mobile phone applications because of the nature of the competitive world that they lived in. But most of the teams that I've worked with had a lot of systems engineering, QA requirements that the idea is that you are coming out at the end of the 2 weeks with accomplishments, but not necessarily a shippable product per se. But I'll talk a little bit about that in greater detail. So part of the Scrum framework is that for the beginning of every sprint, you have a planning meeting where the team gets together and figures out what their capacity is during the sprint cycle, whether it's a week to a month. And then there are daily checkpoints, daily Scrum meetings, which are 15 minutes long, for the team to touch base. Basically talk about what did you do today, or what are you planning to do today, what did you do yesterday, and any impediments that are preventing your progress. So the idea here is that you're really having good teamwork and communications. There is a product owner role, which is the person who really understands what it is that you're trying to deliver and can make real-time decisions about priorities. So that's a key person on the team. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking your master story list, which is your backlog. Like I said, that could be a variety of things. Could be stories, could be detailed requirements. You're trying to get that to a very granular level. However, as a general guideline, I say stories should never be something that's going to take more than, say, 3 or 4 days for one individual person to complete. So you're really trying to get to that level of granularity. And typically with stories, you want to have the QA baked in. So these could even be test-driven requirement stories, but you want to have sort of an acceptance defined within the actual story so that they can be validated in some way at the end of when that story is declared done. So you're really slicing it pretty tight because you want to have the work being able to be done in, say, 2 or 3 days, and then actually have some sort of verification built on top of that before you declare that done. So the number of stories that would go into a sprint are dependent on the size of the team and the capacity of the team. Generally speaking, you want to have pretty small teams. The recommendation is usually 7 people plus or minus 2. I've worked with teams as small as 2 people plus a product owner. We had one team that was a product owner, a developer, and a QA person, and then a Scrum Master, who's basically the person that is helping to make sure that the team is adhering to the general guidelines of Scrum and helping the team to remove impediments. Typically that person is not a project manager per se, because the team, you really want to get to a point where they're empowered to own their own work, although project managers can play the role of a Scrum Master if they sort of adopt the right outlook, which is really more one of facilitation than being a taskmaster per se. But really, I think the value of Scrum comes in terms of the teamwork, the direct collaboration with the stakeholders, so that you're really verifying the quality as you go in short cycles. There's a review meeting that takes place at the end of every sprint, during which the team sort of shows off what has been done, what's been built, and stakeholders can participate in that review, whether it's the single product owner or a group of managers or customers. But the idea is that you're building in those review cycles very often. From a systems engineering perspective, the corollary would be, conceptual design reviews, preliminary design reviews, critical design reviews, manufacturing readiness design reviews. I think from a systems engineering perspective, there aren't necessarily any guidelines for how frequently those review checkpoints come up. So if you're using something like Scrum, where you're trying to go to 2 or 4 week cycles, you can see that you're really sort of building in those review cycles much more tightly. And part of, I think, what Agile embraces is that those reviews may be less formal than, a systems engineering preliminary design review or critical design review. They may be less formal in terms of each of the review cycles, but they're more frequent, so that you really get the value of those frequent checkpoints. So this photograph of the NPR team I worked with, they built the PRSS Content Depot, which is a satellite distribution system. It was the first time that IP over satellite solution was developed that integrated content management, scheduled deliveries over the satellite. So basically, for any of you that listen to NPR, the programming that's coming out not just from NPR studios, but from across the United States, from independent producers, from Minnesota Public Radio, from American Public Media, PRI, that all goes through the satellite distribution system and is delivered to thousands of public radio stations across the United States. So it was really an impressive accomplishment that took, like I said, 7 to 10 years, depending on how you track the start and the finish. But it's the first of its kind. So the first iteration of that was done using Waterfall, but then we basically rebuilt the system piece by piece using new technologies and using Agile. So we sort of have an opportunity to sort of compare and contrast the methodologies. And certainly from the team's perspective, they've been at NPR, they've been using Agile since, I'd say, around 2008. They've become sort of, in my mind, a model for a high-performing team. When I talk to them now, they said they couldn't even imagine working in a non-Scrum, non-Agile environment, just because it allows them to really focus in on 2-week cycles and just keep going and eliminate distractions and really work much more efficiently in that way. So I'll talk a little bit more. The NPR team, and most of the teams, frankly, that I've worked with, use a tool called Jira, which is an Atlassian product that provides basically workflow management tools. Some people use it for bug tracking as well. But it provides a number of tools that help Agile teams move forward, both in terms of creating stories and managing backlogs. And then one of the concepts that comes out of Scrum is you get an idea of a team's capacity, or how much work they can accomplish. So this helps with the estimation aspect of working on new products, new services. So as the team evolves, the idea is that their commitment, which is the gray for any 2-week cycle, starts to match to their completion, which is the green. So this was a team that I started working with a few years ago. So their first sprint, they wildly underestimated how much work they could do, hence the gray was low and the green was high. The next sprint they went over the other way, and they got much more ambitious, and so they went the other way. But then over time, you look for these bars to sort of even out. And the real value, if a team gets really good at estimating and calculating their velocity, which is essentially their capacity in any 2-week period or any 4-week period, depending on your cycles, is that it allows you to really have an effective way to predict how long things will take and how much work the team can do, and how you manage trade-offs in priorities, and how you try to also manage the workload of your team, because tools like this will give you metrics as a team goes forward about how much you can really take on, so that, for example, if senior management has multiple competing priorities, you can really focus those trade-off discussions based on some really solid metrics about what is frankly feasible. So that's one of the really strong values that I've seen, and that I think teams appreciate when they really adopt sort of this approach. Because the idea here is that this is a team-oriented methodology. It's not a management, crack the whip tool. So having these kinds of metrics are really to the team and the workers' benefit, because they can really sort of manage where they are and how much capacity they have with some meaningful metrics. So there's a couple of myths that I want to talk about as I go through this. A lot of people, I think, have a tendency to think that efforts that require rigorous requirements, testing, or compliance don't work in Scrum. And while it's true that Scrum is a methodology that enables you to move forward even if requirements are not understood up front, and provides frameworks in the planning meetings and other activities that you can sort of define requirements in real time, working with your stakeholders or your product owners. My experience has been that most of the teams that I've worked with actually have rigorous requirements, for requirements, and QA testing requirements. So the notion that you don't have upfront requirements doesn't necessarily apply. In fact, the teams that I worked with in NPR, for example, we manage the requirements process as a separate Scrum team, and I'll show you a graphic in a little bit of how you sort of sequence the requirements pipeline to feed into the development pipeline to then feed into the QA pipeline. So you can still manage all of that work in sprints. So I think the notion that Scrum is really for anticipating a lot of unknown requirements up front isn't necessarily always the case, and you could certainly make it work despite the fact that you may have rigorous requirements or QA needs. So this graphic kind of illustrates what I'm talking about, where there's really a cycle here that the requirements can almost go through an agile approach themselves, where you have a requirements backlog, the requirements are getting vetted, you can work those in 2 to 4 week cycles, deliver the stories, create the product backlog, which then gets decomposed into the development team's backlog. So you can really run sort of a cycled approach throughout the entire workflow effort. This is a systems engineering recommended tool called a requirements verification traceability matrix. So typically an RVTM would include, you tag your requirements IDs to unique numbers, and then you want to have your requirements, Again, pretty fine-grained. Your measurement type, whether it's a measurement of effectiveness or a measurement of performance, the status, you can have associated risks, you could assess complexity, but then you want to have that flow down from requirement to verification and traceability from the entire process. So from a systems engineering perspective, we usually look at verification as the specific tests or evaluation that you're going to perform to make sure that the requirement meets the specifications. The validation is, did what you deliver meet the customer goals? So at a higher level, did you deliver the right thing versus does it work? So there are a variety of tools. The requirements verification traceability matrix can typically be an Excel file. But I think if you look at tools like Jira, you would see that if you're putting in your requirements and your acceptance criteria and your testing, you can also get something that looks a lot like a requirements traceability matrix out of a tool like Jira or version 1 or Pivotal Tracker or other tools like that. So there's a lot of methodologies that you can use, a lot of tools that you can use for verifying that traceability, which is what you want to have between your requirements and your verification. So these are examples, a couple examples of screenshots from Jira. This first one is a team backlog. So you'll see that there's individual stories. I realize it's small and blurry, but just conceptually, you manage a backlog of individual stories. You can see here that different team members had different avatars for their roles. So they pick up these stories and then they get assigned to individuals. We tagged, in all the projects that I worked on, we've tagged things like epics, which can be either your work package if you're doing a work breakdown structure. It could be a project if you have a team that's working on multiple simultaneous activities. In an ideal world, you'd have a team that was working on one thing, but the reality is a lot of the teams that I've worked with had to juggle different responsibilities, so you can sort of track different projects. But the idea is that you're managing the team's work, regardless of whether they're working on one thing or trying to balance multiple different things. And then Jira also has Scrum Boards and Kanban Boards, which look very similar, where you can actually move these individual stories across different columns, and these can be customized. So you could have your not started, in progress, QA, your completed, issues. So you can move things across different columns that are completely customizable. It's fun to have things electronically, and it's also fun to be able to move stories into done columns. So that's one value of the electronic boards. And Jira also has a lot of tools for tracking progress. So this was a board that I had set up for a construction and commissioning of a first of its kind phased array receiver that was built in collaboration between the NRAO and GBO sites. I started this board. The project had been in the design phase well before I joined it, but when I started working on this project in November of 2015, it was just entering into the construction phase. Basically, I used this board to take it from construction to commissioning, which happened last summer in July. So it was a huge receiver. It was a 950-pound receiver that got built especially for the GBT, the Green Bank Telescope. And I found, while I was also tracking this in Microsoft Project, from a toolkit perspective, I liked the fact that you could create these sort of visual progress graphics in Jira, which I found to be an effective tool when meeting with senior management so that they could actually see that work is progressing on a regular schedule. So the orange represents the backlog of items to be done. The teal represented work that was in progress. The green was work that was completed, and purple is where we were tracking issues. So to my earlier point, you'll see that we essentially got to the commissioning phase without all of the work that was in the backlog being 100% done. And that was because we decided at the end that, frankly, we were good to go without some of those last, maybe more esoteric pieces being done. I was basically tracking this on a 1 to 2 week basis. We would have weekly status meetings. So the lines are a little bit jagged, which is a reflection of the fact that I was tracking at that level of granularity, probably would have had much more smooth flow up had I been tracking like even on a daily or more rigorous basis. But you know, that kind of just depends on the nature of the project. I mentioned earlier that you know, the notion of Scrum resulting in a shippable product at the end doesn't necessarily always work when you have a lot of rigor around testing and requirements analysis. So this is, again, I realize it's a bit blurry, but you'll see that you know, you can set up with some planning, you can set up the sequencing of activities such that it works within the 2-week cycles, but that it may be, you know, multiple cycles before you actually have something that you've produced and built and are ready to deploy or, you know, ship out. So this was an example from NPR team. So, you know, this was essentially the developer cycles. This was the requirements team. So, for example, this block of work was staged so that it would feed into the developers in time for this sprint cycle to start. So basically, we would sequence the pipeline of the requirements into the backlog for the developers, and then coming out of that, these represent the sprints. You know, we had development environment, a staging environment, which was a complete replica, mostly, of the live environment, and then we had the live system going into production, and there was also a fully redundant backup system located in Minnesota Public Radio. Should the NPR headquarters go down, we could switch to Minnesota. So we were staging all of these release cycles at NPR across all of these different environments, and the fact that the staging cycles are protracted just represents the fact that we had rigorous requirements around functional testing and regression testing that really could not be contained within 2-week cycles. So the expectation was that as developers built their 2-week increment or product, that would go into unit testing, which is run you know, regularly daily, and then some sort of preliminary validation of the acceptance criteria within the 2-week cycle. But then it would flip out into a much longer QA testing cycle for running functional and regression testing, which would then be compiled. You know, you might have 4, 5, 6 different sprints compiled into a final release. So it is possible to manage work that way, and it worked very well for the team when I was working at NPR. I think they've maybe even in the world of continuous improvement, I believe they've even tightened this up more, but certainly during the time that I was there, I know that this ultimately worked well and reflected a compromise between the need for the rigor on compliance and testing versus, you know, trying to maintain the work in 2-week increments. So concept of all of these methodologies, Lean and Agile, is visual management. So this was like a corridor for the technology group at the Urban Institute, where we were lucky enough to be able to take over the walls. And so it's nice to have these different boards where teams' individual sprint cycles are being tracked. Even though it might also be electronic, having the low-tech sticky notes is really effective, because then the team can get together, they can move sticky notes. There's an equally gratifying feeling of moving a sticky note as there is for an electronic ticket. And it also has the added value of being transparent. So if senior management walks through, the CIO walks through, sometimes the president would come through, you get a sense of the project status, you know, how things are moving through the pipeline, if there are issues, and also just the energy and enthusiasm that's surrounding the work. So I highly recommend, you know, having visual management tools. If you remember the slide I showed you with the NPR team, they went with an electronic board, but it's out in a public space, so their Jira board is always up for anybody to come by and see. So that's an option too if your team prefers more high-tech, but I tend to like the old-fashioned Post-it notes. So this, for example, is a Kanban board. Kanban is like Sprint. Again, you could use Jira for that. It just isn't time-boxed into specific iterations. So in other words, you have your entire backlog mapped out, and then you move things across. The idea is that you're sort of managing flow and sort of limiting how much work you have in progress, but you're not necessarily trying to confine it within, these 2 to 4 week sprint cycles. This was a project that I started last December that delivered in October of 2016 with a preliminary design review that was successful, where the team was building a cryogenic compressor. It was actually, I think, one of the first times that sort of this dual combo gas flow design had been used. So I kind of sprung it on this poor gentleman that you see on the left. He looks a little bit cynical, I think, but he was receptive to giving it a try. And so basically we had different columns for not started, in progress, if there are issues, and then done. And the sticky notes moved across the board. And ultimately, I think it was successful. If for no other reason than I know when his manager would come and talk to him, or I would show up and once a week to try to figure out where things were. It was a nice visual and easy way to sort of tell how work was moving across and whether there were any things that were stagnant. And I think he enjoyed the fact that he could move his Post-it notes across the board. So I think most people will be receptive to introducing these techniques if you're not already using them, as long as you kind of go into it with the right approach. Certainly this was a learning exercise for both him and I considered it a moment of achievement when he mentioned to me at the end that we hadn't sliced our stories finely enough. Some of these stories actually were multiple weeks worth of work in the end. So I think going into this the next time around, we'll be able to come up with something that's a little more finely grained, because then you can actually see things moving across more quickly. So that segues into my next point, which is there's a lot of people that think that Scrum and Agile are only for software. And certainly they came out of the software industry, but this graphic is from the 2016 Scrum survey that was done by the Scrum Alliance, and we're really starting to see it penetrate into other areas, including hardware, operations, and production. So I think the techniques are really applicable. Just a few examples. This was the board for a communications team that I worked with. So they took it and had fun with it. They turned it into an airline analogy. It had things in takeoff and landing. We had an administrative team at the Urban Institute that was supporting the researchers that created their own board. And one of the nice outcomes of this not only was that they were tracking their work in monthly increments, but at the end of the year they could print out this massive report that showed everything that they had done for the performance evaluations. I have not personally had experience working with this, but I know some of you may be from the automotive or manufacturing industries. There is an example that's been talked about a lot of extreme manufacturing with Wikispeed that was developing prototype cars. So you'll see that they have their visual management, they created teams. I've included links at the end of my presentation for some presentations. There was a TEDx talk, there was also a Scrum for Hardware talk that were done that would give you a lot more detail about how they went about it, if that's something of interest. But basically they took a modular, prioritized approach to how they did their work, and they did do sprints, and they did do test-driven development, even though it was manufacturing rather than software. So there's a lot of good examples out there of how these techniques are being applied more broadly than just the software industry. So I've talked a lot about Scrum, which is an agile methodology, but there's also Lean, which is mostly focused around process improvement and the elimination of waste in sort of your cycle. So Lean typically might lend itself better if you're like doing routinized production. The idea is that if there's a high volume of output and little variability, then that sort of lends itself to Lean, whereas Agile is maybe where you're more doing R&D, prototyping, and building sort of one-off things. So that's certainly an approach that you can take in terms of applying these methodologies. A lot of Lean is based around looking at your value streams. This example is just at the highest level of, sort of the value stream for your organization. And then you could look at individual steps of processes if you really wanted to get into sort of looking at manufacturing processes, to look at the cycle time between steps, and how you can maybe improve things if something has to go out to get QA tested because you don't have a lab, then that's obviously impacting the cycle time, and maybe, you know, if you can make a case for the fact that you need a lab or things like that. So by looking at the cycle time between steps, you're really looking at things that are non-productive uses of time between sort of the essential functions. And again, I'll put in a plug. I think I saw that there's a value stream mapping session coming up in September that I'm sure we'll go into a lot more detail about this. I've also included a reference on my last slide to a book on value stream mapping that I would recommend if this is something that you want to delve into more deeply. So at Urban Institute, one of the first things that I did when I started there was people were complaining constantly about their proposal development process. And so we spent a week with about 30 people in a room and used lean methodologies to map what was then their current state. And that came out with this impressive chart that went across the entire wall. And essentially anything that you see in yellow was an actual step. Anything that you see in pink was where people identified that there was an inefficiency, things just weren't working the way they thought they should. So going across the top, you have all of the steps that led from, you know, identification of an opportunity for which they wanted to submit a proposal to the actual submission of the proposal. And then the different groups came down the left side. So for example, you know, the research center, obviously, you know, the general counsel's group, IT, if there were things that needed to be built. So you have all of the budget group, so all of the actors that got involved in the proposal development. So we spent a week mapping this out using Lean. So Lean isn't just, while it came from manufacturing and specifically from Toyota, Lean has a lot of applications in terms of looking at business processes, manufacturing processes, basically anything that maybe needs to be fine-tuned. So at the end of the current state process, and we went away for a couple months, did some analysis, brought their group back together and mapped the future state, which was their desired way to streamline the process. So considerably fewer sort of iterations through things. You know, the blue represents that we wanted to try to do is interventions to make things better. So again, you can apply these techniques of getting people together and at all levels and all groups across the process to look at these what they call Kaizen events to determine, you know, where you can make improvements for any number of different types of applications. We basically took some of the interventions that we came out with and mapped them into, you know, ease of use versus impact using a chart like this. If something was easy and high impact, just do it. Go for it. It's easy. It'll result in a high impact. Don't waste time. Zone 2 were things that were priorities. Zone 3 were quick wins. So you'll see that there's lesser impact, but if they're easy to do, there's quick wins. And then the Zone 4 things were things that the team thought were very complex, but would be a high impact. So we had to look at, you know, maybe we need to do more work in terms of chunking them and tackling those later. But that can be part of your process improvement efforts. And essentially, we had the teams working on 30, 60, 90-day plans. So they would try to do some of the quick win stuff within the 30 days while they were thinking about what could be done within the 60 and 90-day cycles. So kind of giving us some long lead times, relatively speaking, to try to map out improvements. There's something called an A3 template, and I know ASQ has done a webinar on this, but essentially it's just a tool for trying to provide a clear and concise view of what you're trying to accomplish. Again, I've included some references there, but it's nice because rather than starting out by creating a 100-page, 20-page requirements document, if you can summarize it easily into an A3 template, that gives you a good starting point of being really able to make a case in a concise manner. Risk, always important, you know, from a project management perspective. So, you know, the idea is that if you can identify risk, identify the triggers that might cause risk to happen, and revisit the contingency and build those into your short cycles, then you'll have a much more controlled manner of dealing with the risks that may come up. So part of what's inherent in Agile is the ability to respond to surprises, which hopefully can sometimes be good, but certainly any negative ones, that gives you the ability to sort of adapt and reprioritize. So the last myth I wanted to sort of hopefully bust is that you know, a lot of people say, well, our situation is unique, so none of this will work for us. We don't have product owners that are available. You know, we can't fit our work into 2 or even 4-week cycles. You know, we're not co-located. So I would encourage you to give it a try. If there's anything here that resonates with you, give things a try. None of the teams that I've worked with have been similar. The team at NPR was lucky to have a dedicated product owner, product manager, who sort of led the effort and prioritized the effort. But at Urban, we had researchers that were product owners and the system experts, and they were not available. They would be traveling, or they would not be consistently available. So we had to kind of compromise and make team leads the product owners. So while that's not necessarily considered optimal, we found a way to work around it. And then because that team was also dealing with multiple products simultaneously, you know, we'd stagger review meetings and have different sessions with different product owners. So there are compromises that you can make. I mean, obviously you want to try to bend the frameworks but not completely go off the reservation. But I think there are things that you can do to make things work no matter what the circumstances. So I'd encourage you to try to run experiments and not give up too soon, and also not just sort of declare this to be any of these tools to not be a good fit just because of your circumstances. So to get started, some of you may already be started, but you know, generally it's recommended to have a sponsor or product owner, assemble a team, select the tools, the product, the processes that you want to try this out on, understand where you are and what problems you're trying to solve, introduce some of the tools and techniques. I've touched on a few. Work towards what your goals are, but then, you know, within the, whether you're using lean or agile or systems engineering or all of the above, is to try to make sure that you have regular checkpoints for reviewing and doing retrospectives. So as I mentioned, I've got a few resources that I've put up, some around Scrum, some around Jira, the Wikispeed, video presentations, value stream mapping, A3 templates. So when Norval posts out the PDF file, you know, these links will be available if you want to take a look at any of these in particular. So I know I've been talking a lot, so just wanted to conclude this part. I know we only have a couple minutes left, but if there are any burning questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Okay, Laura, thanks very much. Laura, thanks very much. Appreciate your giving this talk for us today. Are you able to see the chat box by chance?
I am. So I see that there's a question from Ronald Kelly. He's asking, how does Agile handle dependencies? Must complete A before B. So that's, I mean, that's not unusual. When you're prioritizing work in your sprint backlog, that's a place where you would simply say, okay, in this 2 weeks, we're going to prioritize this aspect of the work. And you can also, within the 2 weeks, you know, so you could obviously stagger, you know, that you have to complete A before B within the sprint or even beyond the sprint boundary. So one thing happens in sprint A and the next thing happens in sprint B. There's also a notion for what they call spikes, and that's basically a time box opportunity for somebody to do research because maybe they don't know how long something's going to take. But the idea is that you're trying to time box things and not just leave things unbound for people to do R&D or research. So if there's a new technology that somebody wants to use, you say, okay, in this 2 weeks, I'm going to give you 8 hours or 16 hours to work on that. So that's another concept that it can be used within Agile. I think that's the only question I've got. Let me see.
No, actually, you've got two more longer ones. You got one from Henderson Thomas, and you also have one from Corwin Anderson. Can you see those two?
Yeah, let's see. Corwin Anderson says, I've heard it said that for regulated industries like energy, automotive, aerospace, medical devices don't benefit from agile development since it adds extra overhead. So again, I would say, go look at the Wikispeed example is a good example, I think, in the automotive industry in particular of how they adopted the Scrum methodologies, the test-driven development approaches, the compliance requirements into sprints. Generally speaking, I would say that Agile is less overhead. It sounds like you have to do the planning, the daily stand-ups, but I think, hopefully, at the conclusion with the myths that I addressed, you can make it work even if there are rigorous requirements and compliance needs. Bake that into the work cycles. Let's see, Henderson Thomas. It seems like Scrum would result in product patchwork as it nears the end of development. But the individual responsible for that one small piece will likely only be concerned with that one piece. So again, this is where the teamwork aspect of this is key because a Scrum team is a team. Now, you may have different specialists working within that team. In an ideal world, maybe everybody would be cross-functional, but if you have different specialists, they're working collaboratively as a team. There's the daily stand-ups. There's a review meeting at the end of each cycle, which could be 2 to 4 weeks. So you really do get, I believe, a checkpoint on a much more close basis than you might if you were doing something in a waterfall where you might have your software team doing one thing and your engineering team doing another, and you won't know if they're truly coming together until you get to, say, a PDR or CDR. So I think actually Agile is designed around creating those checkpoints that allow you to tell and to do those rechecks on a much more granular basis. So I don't know, I've seen some comments about bandwidth and feedback, but I don't necessarily see any more questions. Do you see anything else, Norval?
No, not at the moment, I don't.
Okay. Great. Well, Norval, thank you, and ESQ again. And I know when this gets posted, there are links out there, so hopefully you may find something useful that you can investigate further. Yes.
Excuse me, Laura, there's one more question that just came in very last second. I don't know if you can see it. Is Agile and Scrum very specific to the IT industry?
So again, I would say no. One of the myths that I had put up was that it's no longer considered an IT oriented framework. In fact, there's been a lot of movement, in the Scrum surveys that have been done to show that it's really penetrating into operations, production, hardware, engineering, R&D, sales and marketing, financial accounting. Some of the teams that I told you I worked with vary from communications to business development to obviously software to one-off compressor hardware development. So I've really seen the methodology take off and be applied in a variety of different types of organizations and a variety of different types of teamwork.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions. So before we head off, it looks like some people are starting to drop off. We'd like to thank, we'll have the PowerPoint available. We will share that with folks. That's a question here, so we'll gladly share that as well as the link to the recording for this, as well as the link to the feedback survey. One quick reminder, we will have our next webinar 15 days from now. It'll be on July the 12th. This is a Wednesday, and it's an introduction to customer journey management by Peter Hayes, CCXP, Chief Product Officer for Traceability Group Incorporated. So we hope to see many of you there. Thanks again, Laura, for presenting today. And if nobody has any further questions, we'd like to wish everybody a best day, and thanks for joining us. Bye now.